Natasha mentioned, previously I worked as a curator of architecture and design at SFMOMA in San Francisco, and before that had a gallery that dealt with experimental art and architecture in New York. And it's worth knowing because it explains something of my approach to this place, which is not only to steward a historic site and a historic house museum, but in a sense to reinvent it as a kind of curatorial platform. And that's particularly interesting in this case because it always was one. Philip Johnson is really the founding curator of architecture in the world. He was the first when he took over the new department at the Museum of Modern Art around 1930, and very much used the Glass House as a place for curatorial experimentation with art, architecture, and landscape. So I see it very much as continuing a legacy into a new phase. The Glass House is about 1 hour from New York City in the hills of southwestern Connecticut in a town called New Canaan. It's an interesting town. It's near some other places you might know, such as Greenwich, Darien, places of, if you will, old money, very large houses. It's a very wealthy area. But New Canaan was unusual because it was not quite of the same class, and in the 1940s and 50s welcomed a number of modern architects to build there. And it's quite a small town, but there are actually about 100 modern homes still standing there, built by the Harvard Five, who included Elliot Noyes, Marcel Breuer, Philip Johnson, John Johansson, and Landis Goris. Here you see Johnson at the time that the Glass House was completed. He was photographed by Arnold Newman, one of many very important photographers who photographed Johnson and this place. And this was originally for Life magazine. At this point, Johnson was 46 years old. He was born in Cleveland, Ohio. His father was an attorney, a patent attorney. And as the three children, Johnson and his two sisters, were coming of age, his father gave them all gifts to help them into adulthood. He thought the daughters would need more assistance as they were young women, so he gave them cash and real estate. And he gave his son some stock, thinking that he could take chances with that. Well, the stock turned out to be a new company called Alcoa, and by the time Johnson went to college, he was a multimillionaire. So he went to Harvard, where he studied classics and philosophy. Actually took 7 years to complete his degree, and left that. Met Alfred Barr, the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, at his sister's graduation at Wellesley, and was invited by Barr to travel around Europe with him and Henry Russell Hitchcock, who became co-curator of the seminal exhibition on modernist architecture in America in 1932. And so it began. Johnson worked at the Museum of Modern Art for about 4 years, and then left to pursue a career in politics that was a very complex one that he would later regret. He became first involved with the far left wing in America, then the far right wing in America, and very soon came under the sway of National Socialism in Germany, and was actually a contributor to a right-wing American journal about the developments in Nazi Germany all the way until 1940. Returned to America, where he entered the U.S. Army. He was watched closely by the FBI. Finished his service, and then went back to Harvard to pursue an architecture degree. So imagine the first curator of architecture had never actually studied architecture, but had immersed himself in travel and learning through books. But then he takes his professional education, and as his thesis degree, builds his first house, which is in Cambridge now. It belongs to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and only completed one other house before the Glass House, so 1949. In the same year, Johnson had gone back to the Museum of Modern Art in I believe 1947, as curator. And in the same year, 1949, he also did a rather incredible project with Marcel Breuer, which was the first House in the Garden project. Johnson had designed the sculpture garden at MoMA, and over the next 2 years invited 3 different architects to present full-scale houses in the garden. This is a single photograph from the exhibition I mentioned in 1932, International Architecture, an exhibition which came to be known as the International Style Show. Co-curated by Johnson with Hitchcock, it is credited with bringing European modernism to America. Next. And this is the machine art exhibition that Johnson curated in 1934, which was really the first exhibition of its kind to elevate industrial design to the status of something that could be shown in a modern art museum. And here, a 1948 exhibition with Mies van der Rohe, the first exhibition of Mies's work in the United States. Johnson had commissioned Mies to design his own apartment in New York in 1930, which was Mies's first American commission, and always viewed Mies as a kind of father figure, eventually working with him on the Seagram building and designing the Four Seasons restaurant. Here, a very advanced exhibition for its day where actual works, furniture were exhibited against very large-scale photomurals that provided a sense of interior space. So here is the original site plan of the glass house. When it was, Johnson purchased 5 acres of land in 1946. And by 1949, the 2 buildings that then constituted the glass house were complete. Number 3 is the brick house, and number 5 is the glass house. And one very useful way to think about them is as a single house that had been split in 2. Next. And here you see that relationship where the glass house is a completely transparent pavilion. It's about 180 square meters. It's quite modest in scale. The brick house about the same, but completely opaque, except for these 3 windows on the side that you don't see from the glass house, and a number of skylights that emit light. And there's a courtyard between them that is very manicured and was organized in a very special way. Next. This idea of the split house is articulated in a rather subtle way with the wall that you face as you approach the courtyard. The wall itself splits, and a tree that also splits was placed there. And really very little has changed over the years. The candelabra is no longer there. It was replaced by a lamp, but essentially this seating arrangement of Mies van der Rohe furniture, the glass coffee table, the sculpture by Ellie Nadelman, the furnishings, the plants, it's really very much as Johnson intended it. Here you have a sense of how the site grew over time as additional parcels were added. Here we're in the interior of the brick house, and the brick house didn't look like this when it was complete. It had more rooms and was actually quite spare. But as I mentioned, Johnson was always tinkering, and as an architect, he's perhaps best known for having no signature style whatsoever. The brick house was a place where Johnson often stayed. It was sometimes used for guests, but at one time there was actually a sauna. If you think about these as 2 houses that have been split apart, the glass house was really about kind of public presentation, and the brick house was always about greater privacy and sensual and bodily pleasures as well. Next. And here you see a more contemporary view of the glass house and the brick house and the pool that was added in 1955. You also start to get a sense of the landscape. It's a 49-acre site now. Much of it is wooded, but the kind of primary part of the landscape, which is quite large, was completely reinvented by Johnson and his partner David Whitney, who came onto the scene around 1960. They acquired a number of older structures as the property grew. This was the first to be added, a house that was renamed Popestead after the married name of one of Johnson's sisters. Next. And developed the lower landscape. So you see the glass house on its promontory there with a very carefully placed line of trees whose lower limbs have been removed, so they have a very kind of architectural effect as they frame views into this lower landscape. In 1962, they added the pond and the pond pavilion here, which was it followed the transformation of the brick house, but it was the first public presentation by Johnson of a kind of postmodern neoclassicist approach to architecture, for which he would become known much later. The decadence at the time was even more pronounced because there was a fountain that shot a jet of water 120 feet, so 40 meters into the air, the height of the glass house itself. And it really marked the transformation of the glass house into a kind of pleasure park, if you will. So as I mentioned, Johnson met David Whitney in 1960. Whitney was 35 years younger than Johnson. They met at a lecture that Philip gave at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. Here you see an entrance to the painting gallery, which was completed in 1965. And here the painting gallery in action, if you will. It has these fantastic walls that are carpeted that rotate like a kind of postcard rack. And here you see the painting gallery now. And this single portrait from 1972 by Andy Warhol, Philip Johnson in a grid of 9. 5 years later, they added the sculpture gallery. Next. Which is in a way a kind of opposite idea to the glass house. The glass house, of course, has all walls of glass and an opaque roof. Here the building is opaque, the entire roof is glass. It's sloped, very beautiful quality of light, as well as very strong shadows when the sun hits the mullions. We have roughly 20 sculptures left. So the sculpture gallery was completed in 1970, and then 7 years later, Philip added an entrance gate here now in the period of high modernism. And then in 1980, a building that is a kind of library and study. He felt it was too distracting to work inside the glass house, so he created a very opaque volume to do his work. There's a single window that looks toward the ghost house, which you'll see in a moment. This building was acquired, which is now the director's home, my home on the property. Originally they had planned a heather garden, but it didn't take, so instead they created this garden of succulents, whose form is based on a Malevich drawing that they had acquired that year. You see the ghost house, which was completed in 1984. It's one of several follies on the property. It really has no function. You see that every few years it's overgrown with creeping ivy so that it becomes a kind of hermitage. There's a theme on the site, we'll talk about it a bit more, of sort of temporality and entropy, if you will, how things change, how things decay. This is a very good example of their interest in that. And then in 1985, Johnson added this folly, if you will, or sculpture. It's a staircase that was built on the occasion of his friend Lincoln Kirstein's 80th birthday. This is one of several ways in which Johnson also populated the site with autobiographical references, with things that had to do with friends and family. And then this was the final old structure to be added. It's across the road from the rest of the property. It was a much larger house, painted very differently, and they stripped it back again to this kind of iconic New England salt box shape. Philip was the landscape architect, David was the gardener, and he developed this really beautiful garden of peonies, all of which can be viewed through a window that was etched by Michael Heiser. So one of a number of kind of site-specific works on the Glasshouse campus. The last major building to be complete was called the Monster, which is a kind of rapper's way of saying the monster. Philip was very interested in rap music in those days, and was with this building looking back at a kind of pre-modern tradition of German expressionism, but also at work that was happening at the time. It was around the time of deconstructivism, so the work of Zaha Hadid and Frank Gehry were very important. And here you see, again, the landscape and the relationship of these two pavilions, the library and the Monster up the hill. The very last structure to be built on the site was a doghouse that you see here. Next. One of the important ways that the Glasshouse was used was as a kind of weekend retreat. So it was, very much a demonstration of the young architect's capacities, but quickly became a place for him to go relax on weekends, and especially in summer. In its glory as a place for picnics, it really was a kind of place for entertaining, a place to go for cocktails by the water. But it was also an important gathering place from very early on. This is a photograph from 1964 where you see Philip and his friend, who was his eye doctor, along with Robert Stern, David Whitney, and Andy Warhol. And the Glasshouse as a kind of salon for important thinkers, it really characterized its life for several decades, where leading minds in the arts and architecture would come together, often meeting philanthropists and other kind of society people. Here you see Andy Warhol in bed in the brick house with David Whitney peeking out the window. And a benefit for Merce Cunningham in 1967. And here you see the Vogue write-up of A Country Happening. John Cage was there, Andy Warhol, the Velvet Underground performed. It was quite an important event in its day. Another important gathering that took place at the Glasshouse was the wedding of Rosamund Bernier and John Russell, with Leonard Bernstein and Virgil Thompson in attendance. I had mentioned this idea of a kind of autobiographical landscape, and certainly one of the ways to understand the transformation of the landscape, and you have a sense in the distance of what the neighboring properties look like, very heavily wooded, is a return to the kind of farmland that Philip remembered from his youth growing up near Cleveland. And this view from the Glasshouse, from the kind of workspace, which is really right next to the bed, looks right at a pair of trees that Philip named for his parents, Thelma and, blanking on the name, Thelma, it'll come to me in a moment, Homer and Thelma. And this autobiographical aspect continues in many details. So as you're approaching the Glasshouse, which is just down the hill, there's a single tree set into a very open plain, which is a horse chestnut that resembles the state tree of Ohio, the Buckeye tree, and sort of references to earlier parts of his life. And very strange, in the drive there is a manhole cover from Cleveland, Ohio. So this is one of the sort of enigmatic qualities of the site that I find quite fascinating. Almost as if the site represents the sort of unconscious or a dream work of Johnson. One of the great mysteries is this table that sits out in the woods, very hard to find. It's seven-sided. No one knows why. I think it might be because Johnson designed 7 structures for the site, but it's almost a kind of altar. The glass house was also acted as a kind of laboratory for Johnson to experiment with different ways of working with architecture, different motifs, different languages, if you will. So here in two projects, the Rockefeller Guesthouse and the Wiley House, you see a combination of the brick house and the glass house into a new composition. Next. Or here you see the Lake Pavilion that you now know well, and the Beck House. Or here the vaults that I mentioned inside the brick house, reworked again as the vaults for the Beck House in Dallas. And the painting gallery and the Geyer House, the sculpture gallery and the Fort Worth Water Garden. And in the same year, De Monsta and the Cathedral of Hope. So if Johnson was kind of reworking his own architectural language at the Glass House and elsewhere, he was also very much working with that of others that he admired. Principally Mies van der Rohe, whose Farnsworth House was on the drawing boards when Philip was very close with Mies. He knew the project from Mies, but Johnson completed his Glass House first. So this became the first house to be faced with sheets of large glass. But Johnson very clearly credited Mies always, though the houses are very different, actually, different in many ways. And when Mies van der Rohe came to the Glass House, he was critical of a number of details, particularly the way that the corners were resolved. But Mies's house is very much about it's really about the ideas of high European modernism, about a kind of infinite horizontality of space as it raises up above the ground. Philip's is much more rooted as it sits on the ground. Many, many differences to explore. Next. One of the lesser known references for the Glass House was the screened porch of Gropius's own house outside of Cambridge, where of course, he was dean at Harvard when Philip was there, and Philip would have visited this structure and perhaps gained an interest in a house that kind of vanishes into the landscape. The Glass House was immediately publicized in many important magazines of its day, and then in 1950, Johnson did something very unusual, which was to write about the house himself in an architectural magazine. It was Architectural Review in 1950, where he became a kind of critic or historian of his own house. And in a number of kind of double spreads, presented historical references in art, architecture, landscape, even farm planning, all of which would serve to illustrate what he was thinking about as he developed the initial composition of the glass and brick house together. As he was working through the history of architecture, here is the breakfast room at Sir John Soane's house that I mentioned, and the brick house. Sir John Soane is a very interesting kind of point of reference for Johnson because he is an architect who is also a collector and a historian of architecture. I'm sure many of you have know of or have been to this amazing house, now House Museum in London, where Soane collected fragments of architectural antiquity and presented them in a very dense, almost like a kind of a tomb of the history of ancient architecture. And here, with the Lake Pavilion, a clear reference to Robert Delaney's painting of Saint-Séverin. The painting gallery was a very explicit reference to the tomb of Atreus in Mycenae from 1250 BC. And the Ghost House has multiple points of reference, but one of them certainly is the Vanaventuri house that Robert Venturi designed for his mother, that was really perhaps the first articulation of postmodernism in America. And the tower for Lincoln Kirstein, perhaps a reference to Totlin's Monument to the Third International. And Demonsta explicitly a reference to a design by Frank Gehry for a Kunsthal in Dresden. The interior of the house, in the architectural review that I mentioned a moment ago, Johnson states something rather odd, which is that the hearth, which is the center of the house, the brick hearth, reminds him of a burnt wooden village that he once saw, all that remained of a burnt wooden village. And this is, again, where we start to get into a little bit off-the-road interpretation, because with that, Johnson is admitting that he was in Poland when the Nazi army invaded. He was writing about it. He was watching Polish villages burn. And the glass house may be seen in part as an effort to rehabilitate his reputation, because certainly in late 1940s America, there was really no one of this level of visibility who had been so closely associated with the rise of Nazism in Germany. And so Johnson really had to work very hard to if you will, expunge or expiate his guilt. In this temple of high modernism, Johnson chose to place a painting that Alfred Barr had advised him to buy, which is a painting from 1648, attributed to the school of Poussin, Nicolas Poussin. And it's, of course, in the glass house, it's placed in the worst possible conditions for conservation. It's constantly hit by sunlight with extreme changes. And so why in the world would Johnson have placed this painting there? Well, this is a story of a general, an Athenian general, who makes a deal with the Macedonians that is seen by the population of Athens as treasonous. He's seen to have made a deal with the devil and is forced to drink hemlock and buried outside of the city walls. His wife gathers the ashes and waits and keeps them, and eventually his reputation is rehabilitated and his ashes are brought back into Athens to be buried properly. Another artwork on the site that deals with the transience of power is this work by Julian Schnabel called Ozymandias, a reference to the Shelley poem that talks about the toppled statue of Ramesses II, so a mighty king whose statue has fallen and broken. And here you see Philip toward the end of his life, and David, I'm sorry, you see the two of them. And there is a real, in this photograph, as well as on the site, I think, a real kind of melancholy, quality of a sort of necropolis, if you will, a place for death, a place of ruin, I think is visible in the doghouse, which they came to call an ossuary, a place where you keep bones, because the dogs kept their bones there. And here, off in the woods, a ruin that they kept, probably from a sugar shack or a hunter's cabin, but again, the kind of remaining core of a building that otherwise had vanished. And here, more ruins near the ghost house, ruins of a 19th century dairy barn. And here, the last photograph of Philip, who died in the glass house in 2005 at the age of 98. We use the site for a number of events. We have a regular program of speakers. And one of the programs that I initiated here, actually the first kind of curatorial project, was proposed to me by a man named Jordan Stein, who had done research about the house and discovered that the Giacometti sculpture that had sat on this glass coffee table went missing in the 1960s. It was sent back to Giacometti's studio for repair and never returned. So it was lost, if you will. And so in homage to that, what we've done now is a kind of sculpture in residence project in the same position. Every few months, a new sculpture comes in and then goes away, making way for the next sculpture to come. So here, a Ken Price, Alba Auerbach. And this for me was very interesting because of the kind of thematics of disappearance, reappearance, which I think is central to the idea of maintaining a historic site. So this is the third sculpture by Jason Dodge, which is a kind of bird as if it had flown through. I mentioned that the building known as De Monsta had sat empty. I rededicated it as an art gallery soon after arriving, and we presented an exhibition of new sculpture by Frank Stella, which made a lot of sense because, as I mentioned, the building was inspired by Frank Stella's design for a Kunsthal, but also Stella is the single artist that is best represented in our collection. The second exhibition there, which was up last year, is by Evie Day. She wrapped the building in a kind of web, very much dealing with this idea of a monster, a kind of animated being, and capturing it. And the next project to take place on the site was a kind of pilot, if you will, for an artist in residence program. I invited Alex Schwader to present this project, which is a kind of inflatable living room. We've started doing readings and performances on the site, and one of our performances, here Juliana Barwick performing. And this is our upcoming exhibition. This is actually a sketch. We're working with a Japanese artist named Fujiko Nakaya. She works with mist, with fog. And for about 15 minutes every hour, the glass house will be swallowed by a cloud of mist. We're also planning an exhibition on Johnson's celebrity, the way in which he very skillfully manipulated the media to build the extraordinary reputation that he did, here landing on the cover in 1979 of Time magazine, holding the soon-to-be completed AT&T building as if the tablets of Moses. We work with a number of artists. We have many requests from artists who would like to photograph the site. We accept some of them. In this case, Hiroshi Sugimoto, who a pair of photographs by the Brazilian artist Mauro Restife, one of a large group of very beautiful photographs by James Welling. One of the transformations that we've made since I arrived was to completely reinvent the shop. I invited Murray Moss, the great design retailer, if you will, to help us reinvent the shop, and now it's very much inspired by the machine art exhibition. There are a number of preservation projects that we've completed and that are pending. This is one of the real challenges of my position as director, because of course these are very expensive projects. One that we were able to complete last year is the restoration of the painting gallery roof, which was just under $1 million, but very important, of course, to protect the 50-year-old building from leaks that were starting to develop. This project was also completed, the restoration of the Donald Judd sculpture, which is his first site-specific concrete work from 1970. One of the projects that remains is the restoration of the Lake Pavilion, as well as the Brick House, which has been closed since 2008 because of water infiltration, and the Sculpture Gallery, which is the project that we will do next, hopefully this season, if not the following, which is really in terrible condition and is in fact leaking. And that's all. So